Before we begin, it is important that we acknowledge the history of the land Lewis and Clark occupies. Prior to the colonizers arriving in the area, the indigenous land of what would later be called Multnomah County was home to many tribal peoples. We honor the indigenous peoples on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand. The Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Wadalala lands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of them. We honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants.
Good evening, everyone. I am Katerina Enriquez, Symposium Co-Chair, a senior sociology and anthropology major, and a descendant of strong and beautiful migrants who crossed the US-Mexico border. We welcome you tonight to our second keynote event of the 17th Annual Ray Warren Symposium on Race and Ethnic Studies. Our theme, Movement, is a 3-day exploration of the political, bodily, and emotional dimensions of movement and simultaneous confinement and the lives of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. We are honored that you have joined us to learn from an influential scholar who works tirelessly to shed light upon the oppressive, violent systems that affect both physical and emotional realms of migrants who trek across the Sonoran Desert along our southern border.
Thank you, Kasha, for those opening remarks. My name is Emmanuel Harris. I'm a junior sociology and anthropology studies major and also a co-chair for this year's symposium. We are thrilled to present to you our second keynote presentation entitled, Understanding the Politics of Migrant Life and Death Along the US-Mexico Border. Before we begin, we have a few brief announcements. Be sure to follow our social media handles listed on our website. We also encourage you to live tweet during the presentation using the hashtag RWSympLC. Go ahead and share us with your friends and family so they can also be involved with this year's crucial symposium.
We are recording tonight's presentation and will post the video to the symposium website. Other recordings of the talk are not authorized. Additionally, please be sure to visit the incredible virtual art gallery that the Ray Warren Symposium art curators have put much thought and care into creating. Also, Race Monologues is our closing event tomorrow night, where students share personal narratives about their experiences, feelings, and understandings of race and ethnicity. The link to the gallery, along with more information about Race Monologues and other events for this year's symposium, can be found on our website.
We have an exciting lineup scheduled for tomorrow. Lewis and Clark students will present their research at the Race Across Disciplinary Boundaries panels tomorrow morning. Additionally, tomorrow, there will be 2 panels that take on global questions. The first examines heritage, travel, and tourism, and the other focuses on mutual aid and international solidarity movements in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, in collaboration with Students for Cultural Inclusion in the theater, we bring you The People's Verses, a performance that invites the audience to act as a jury in thinking about the nature of social change. All these events links can be found on our website. There will be time for questions and discussions after tonight's presentation. Please post your questions and all inquiries in the Q&A at any time during the presentation, and either Kasha or I will read them aloud at the end.
Tonight, Emmanuel and I, along with the other co-chairs, Shalini, Samantha, and Eduardo, are excited to be hearing from an interdisciplinary anthropologist, archaeologist, and professor who works with material that inspired our entire symposium theme. Professor Jason De León is president of Colibri Center for Human Rights, executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, a 2017 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and professor of anthropology and Chicana studies at UCLA. And we are honored to have him speak tonight about the importance of migration and movement. By looking at migration along the US-Mexico border in relation to race and ethnicity, De León invites us to recognize the importance of physical movement and tracking, death and violence, surveillance and policing that occurs in our own Sonoran Desert, Last year, I read his book, The Land of Open Graves, and was moved by his vivid stories and analyses of what it means for the US to have bodies of migrants decompose on this violently claimed land.
Born in Texas, Professor De León grew up only a few miles away from the Rio Grande, which forms part of the US-Mexico border. Throughout his life, he has returned to this border, collecting and documenting evidence that shows life, death, and movement. To try to understand what that migration means, Professor De León uses tools that he has acquired from his anthropological and archaeological background and his personal desire to call attention to humanity. We see this in his published written work, as well as in art installations and community projects like Hostile Terrain 94, which is sponsored by the Undocumented Migration Project, which he founded and directs. He has made this extraordinary installation accessible in art galleries, college halls, and community spaces across the US and globally. This year, Lewis and Clark, we have the humbling opportunity of featuring the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit on our campus. This exhibit pinpoints where migrants' bodies have been found, creating a personal and moving visual reminder of the scale and scope of this issue. Since the start of the semester, Lewis and Clark students, faculty, and staff have been filling out toe tags with migrants' names, their age, and cause of death, if known, participating as a community in this extraordinary act of remembrance. Watch for the completed installation to go up in Miller.
I had the opportunity to see Jason De León give a presentation on human trafficking at the border during a conference I attended last fall, and I feel humbled to now have the chance to introduce him to the Lewis and Clark community. De León's research examines ideological roots of government power and how it relates to extreme felt experiences of migrants who are forced into various dangerous terrains of the Sonoran Desert, where they are ultimately sentenced to death by the state. He encourages us to question abusive state power and analyze the policies in place that inflict violence on Latinx migrant bodies. He moves our own perspectives and emotions by sharing vivid life narratives of those who have crossed and of families that will never see loved ones again. Tonight we learn, we take action, and we are in community with each other to honor those who have moved across the US-Mexico border. Please join us in a warm welcome for Jason De León.
Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry, this is always the awkward shift here. Okay. Okay. First off, I just want to say thank you so much to Lewis and Clark College, to Karen Brodkin, to all the students for that great introduction, for hosting me, and for all the work that's gone into organizing this talk and making Hostile Terrain 94 happen. I know that this has been an incredibly challenging time for all of us, culturally, politically, medically in some cases, and so just the fact that we're able to still connect with one another in a virtual way during these difficult times is very, very humbling. And so I just want to just take a moment to thank all of you for making this happen, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm sad that I can't be there in person. I do love very much the Pacific Northwest after spending several years teaching at the University of Washington. But as I was telling folks before we began the seminar, that we are anticipating having some physical shows in place, including in places like Portland State. So I may be back in Oregon and Washington in the near future. All right, well, let's get going here. First off, yeah, it's been an interesting week, to say the least. I will say that as we come to the end of this current administration, it's been both a combination of false promises or promises that did not come to fruition, including the construction of a border wall that was supposedly going to be paid for by Mexico. But what we have seen has been a direct assault on the lives and the health and just the existence of immigrants from all over the globe, but especially those coming from Latin America. And as we are transitioning now into this next presidential administration, we are, I think many people are optimistic, one that it's going to be a smooth transition, but more importantly, that it will bring about positive change, positive immigration reform, which I think felt like was on the cusp at the end of the Obama administration. But I do want to say that day one, when Biden et al. Take residence in the White House, it's time to remind them that that the Democrats have in many ways been just as involved in creating brutality towards the lives of migrants as Republicans. And so many of the things that Trump has used in the last 4 years to try to deter migrants and to make their lives incredibly difficult were things that were built by Democrats. And so thinking about things like a virtual wall, which has been talked about as an alternative to Trump's physical wall by Democrats, I want to point out that the virtual wall is part of this big system that has killed thousands of people. And so I think there's a lot of work for all of us to do to work towards comprehensive immigration reform, and to remind Democrats that just because you're not saying something completely ludicrous or inflammatory towards communities of color, it does not mean that you get a free pass. And so I think it's a matter of reminding people that the history of brutality against migrants has been going on for decades, at least in terms of the Arizona desert, and much farther back in terms of American immigration history. So just wanted to say that, and I'm happy to talk about where we're going politically and in regards to immigration in the Q&A. Before we get started, I just want to give a warning that we will talk about some difficult things today, including migrant death. And so I will show a few images that are difficult, but also I believe are important for helping us to understand what has been going on along the U.S.-Mexico border for several decades now. To give us a little bit of architecture here for this talk, I am going to draw from my first book, The Land of Open Graves, and I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about my current book project on human smuggling, which I am in the throes of right now. But we will take a little historical trip to understand the Border Patrol policy known as prevention through deterrence. That will kind of set the stage for most of the talk. I want to introduce a discussion about the violence that happens to migrant bodies in the desert, so forms of post-mortem violence. And to do this, I want to tell 3 different stories about people who have unfortunately lost their lives in the U.S.-Mexico border. People who have been erased by the desert, people who have been returned in an incredibly terrible state physically of the bodies, and then those who disappear. And through those three sort of stories that will be the second half of the talk, I want to just put forth a couple of ideas that you can take away from this. Number one, we don't need a wall. We never needed a wall. And also, walls don't work. But we've been using the Arizona desert as a wall since the mid-1990s. And it has been part of a policy that has directly killed thousands of people. And I'll talk more about that. And these deaths are not unintended consequences of border enforcement policies, but are actually known consequences, direct components of a policy that was designed to injure people, to kill people. And so I want people to understand that the stuff that's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border is not random or senseless. It's all part of a bigger system that's purposefully been deployed there. And then finally, I want people to know that the deaths that happen along the U.S.-Mexico border, they don't stop. The violence does not stop there. The things that happen there have far-reaching repercussions for the families of those who have lost loved ones, and it extends all across the globe. And so, as was mentioned in the introduction, the work that I'm talking about today comes from a project that I founded in 2009 and currently direct. It's called the Undocumented Migration Project, and it's a long-term research, arts, and education collective that's aimed at documenting, humanizing, and raising awareness about the experiences of migrants leaving Latin America and attempting to enter the United States. It's a mix of education, a mix of social science research, as well as artistic practice. So a significant amount of exhibition work, which I'll touch upon briefly. And in general, as an anthropologist, as a social science researcher, I am someone who who wants to live in an interdisciplinary world, and am someone who I think freely steals both from all the subdisciplines of anthropology as well as any other school of thought or discipline where I think interesting things are happening. So this project is a mix of ethnography. I spend lots of time talking to migrants on both sides of the border, archaeology. So I followed migrants around in the desert for many years, picking up the things that they've left behind. I've given cameras to migrants and had them document their own experiences. I've taken a lot of pictures myself. I've dabbled in other things like forensic science, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these things today. But for me, this is like the best kind of mental space for me to be is one where I don't recognize borders between disciplines, because I feel like there's so much to offer and so much growth and innovation that can happen if we don't limit ourselves to our own kind of home discipline. And so that I'm going to kind of show a little bit of all these things today. But before I can get to talking about what's happening right now along the U.S.-Mexico border, I just want to briefly talk about what has happened historically. So you may or may not know that prior to the mid-1990s, most border crossings happened in urban zones, places like El Paso, Nogales, San Isidro, just south of San Diego, and people were mostly hopping fences in these urban zones, attempting to avoid the Border Patrol on foot, but running into these communities where they could blend in with the local population. And so in a place like San Diego, you would go down to the fence at dusk. There would be hundreds of migrants on the Mexican side congregating in a place that was a soccer field and waiting for the sun to come down. As soon as the sun came down, people would rush the fence, hop over, and run into town and try to hide in houses, get picked up in vehicles. And the Border Patrol would be on the other side waiting and would try to catch as many people as they could. But typically, we're not able to get everybody. And this went on for years. In the early 1990s, we're right, around 92 during a presidential election, which we see happening constantly. There was a rising anti-immigrant sentiment. So people were complaining that border crossers were overrunning our cities, that places like San Diego were being invaded by Mexicans. And so it was becoming a political kind of hot button for lots of folks. There was a Border Patrol agent in El Paso, Texas, a man named Sylvester Reyes, who was getting a lot of pressure from his constituents about the visibility of border crossings. And so basically what he did was took a whole bunch of agents, vehicles, helicopters, and lined them up along the fence where migrants had been hopping over and running into downtown El Paso, basically to head to work. People were commuting that way in some sense. So they line it up, kind of show a force, and as soon as people would hop over, they were all getting immediately arrested. So border crossers recognize that they can no longer hop the fence in these places and get through because there's just too many agents. But what they can do is walk 5 or 6 miles east or west where the border fence stops, where there's nobody around, and they can hop the fence and double back into town. And so people started doing that. And so this kind of show of force does not actually stop the flow of people. It just redirects them out to these places where there's less of a population. And so rather than seeing hundreds of people hopping the fence in downtown El Paso, you don't see it anymore because it's become invisible in that it's happening out in the middle of nowhere. This policy was a sort of ad hoc thing developed in around 93. It actually becomes formalized in 1994 under the name of prevention through deterrence. So the Border Patrol decides that they need to seal off these urban ports of entry so that there's no longer this kind of downtown fence hopping, and then they can push people to these other locations. So this happens in 94 and is outlined in a document called the Border Patrol Strategic Plan, which you can find online, and I've written about it extensively in my book. But there's 2 things about prevention through deterrence that you need to know for this talk. Number one, people recognize that, hey, we cannot build a physical wall across the U.S.-Mexico border because it's a border that cuts through mountainous terrain, through deserts. There's rushing water and rivers. It's a place with extreme environments, and so it's not only difficult to maintain a physical structure, it's also a place that's difficult to get across in general. And so it was recognized that, there's extreme heat in these places. You can die of dehydration in the summer in Arizona. You can freeze to death in the winter up in those mountains. You can drown in rivers and in canals. So all of this stuff was recognized by the Border Patrol as a potential asset. But more importantly, they recognized that what you could do then, if you could disrupt the normal flow of traffic through these urban ports of entry and push people out into the middle of nowhere, into the deserts, into the mountains, then suddenly you could have a tactical advantage. Because now you can no longer just hop the fence and you run to a car and you can get away in 20 minutes. If you have to walk now 35 miles across a desert, you can be caught because there's nobody around, and so it's easy to spot people. There's no population to hide in, but also you will find yourself trying to traverse, scorching deserts, rushing water, things that are physical impediments to movement. And so the Border Patrol recognized that if we push people out there in those places, migrants can find themselves in what they call, mortal danger. The idea was if they could force them over what they call hostile terrain, it would be easier then to catch folks. And so that's what they did. That's what we've been doing since 1994 officially. And this is our current security paradigm. We have been doing this for a long time. We don't really talk about it anymore. Even the phrase prevention through deterrence doesn't often get uttered, but occasionally someone like Trump will say something that hints that they actually understand what's going on, including, last year Trump said something like, we don't need to build a wall in every single part of the border. There are some places that are difficult to get across by themselves. And that's part of this security logic. And like I said, it's still going on today. This is the bread and butter for the Border Patrol. This is the number one form of border enforcement that we currently have. And so what we did was we blocked off all these ports of entry, these urban zones, and we left certain parts of the U.S.-Mexico border open, including the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, which you see here. And these labels represent what are called Border Patrol sectors. So the Tucson sector, where southern Arizona is, and the Sonora Desert, we left this open. We left this back door open, and we hope that if we pushed people out of California, out of Texas, and left Arizona open, that people would then have to deal with the environment. And if you go to a place like southern Arizona, like a border town like Nogales or Sassabee, there's a port of entry with some border security there. But if you walk or drive 5 or 6 miles in east or west, you will see that the border fence just drops off and then there's nothing. There's a couple of markers there to indicate that you've crossed over to a different country, but there's nothing to stop the flow of people. And that's because people know that they don't need to put a wall here, because you can hop this fence, it's totally fine. You still then have to walk 50, 60, sometimes 80 miles across a desert to get to your final destination. And so this is what our border wall looks like and has looked like for a very, very long time. And this policy starts in 1994, when migrant deaths were relatively low, considering the number of people who had been crossing. But as this policy gets put into place in the mid-1990s, you have a couple of things happen. Number one, we crash the Mexican economy with the North American Free Trade Agreement. We start flooding that country with things like subsidized corn. We start making it impossible for peasant farmers to make a living growing their own food and selling it at market. So now suddenly you've got thousands of people who are fleeing Mexico in search of a living wage. And we're talking about over 5 million people who have been arrested and deported in southern Arizona alone since the start of prevention through deterrence. So millions of people have left Mexico to try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, but now instead of crossing in Tucson or crossing in El Paso or San Diego, they're trying to cross through the Sonoran Desert of Arizona. At the same time that that's happening, you have this dramatic spike in migrant deaths. So you go from a potential low of like three deaths per 100,000 apprehensions in the Tucson sector in like 1995 to, in its recent peak, 146 per 100,000 deaths in around 2011. So migrant deaths are the spike right after this policy goes into place, and there's a direct positive correlation between this policy and the deaths in Arizona. There's been 3,496 bodies recovered in Tucson alone, in the Tucson sector alone. I'm going to argue that that's actually a low number, but you can see that in 2 decades, we went from just having a couple dozen deaths a year to hundreds of deaths a year, and now thousands of deaths over the long run. And if you start to map it out, so this data here comes from the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, and has been mapped out by a humanitarian group called Humane Borders. You can see here that these deaths in Arizona, I mean, when you start to plot them out, this is a killing field. thousands of people have died here on US soil, and seemingly nobody cares about it, right? Most people don't think about this as a humanitarian crisis, despite the fact that there's a lot of blood here on US soil. And I would point out too that this kind of gap here on the left of the screen, that's not because people aren't dying there. That's a federal bombing range that people are not allowed to access to look for human remains, but there are probably hundreds, if not probably hundreds of deaths that have not been recorded from that area alone. So we're talking about thousands of people who have died. And like I said, it's not an unexpected sort of consequence. These were things that people knew was going to happen, pretty quickly. In 1997, the Government Accountability Office was trying to evaluate whether or not prevention through deterrence was working. And one of the ways that they put forth that you could measure the effectiveness of this policy was a spike in migrant deaths. Because people had argued that if you do this, you will probably see a rise in deaths. And that, of course, has been the case. And so these folks were arguing that, like, actually an increase in migrant deaths means that this policy is actually working. And it was kind of thought that if enough people died early on, that everybody would recognize that it was too dangerous and they would stop coming. But in fact, thousands have died and people still keep coming. And even as migration has slowed, the deaths have continued to rise because it's gotten more deadly. People are trying to cross through more remote areas. And it looks like, despite the fact that we're in a pandemic, that migration is down because of all kinds of things, that we may break the record this year for numbers of recovered bodies in Arizona. So just something to think about. Like, even during this pandemic, there are hundreds of people who are dying right now in this place. And I would argue that all of the stuff that I've just talked to you about, these policies, this use of infrastructure, the way in which death can be a metric for this success of this project, those things to me all speak to the fact that the federal government and many people in the United States do not value the lives of migrants. We see these deaths as the cost of doing security business, and I think that that's a shameful thing, and it's one that I hope that we as a country can soon come to recognize is going on, and perhaps take action to stop this senseless death. And so many of you who are watching have been a part of an exhibition that we developed starting a couple of years ago, which has been an attempt to raise awareness about migrant death in Arizona. So Hostile Terrain 94, which many folks there at Lewis and Clark have been filling out toe tags, has been my attempt to take migrant death and put it into a more kind of human form, or in a way that connects with individual people on a personal level. So we've asked people and asked many of you to take some time to write out the names of the dead and information for those folks. We've created toe tags, and we've given folks information about these deaths, and we've asked them to fill them out. The orange tags represent people who are unidentified, and the manila tags represent those bodies that have known names. And what we've tried to do is take this relatively sterile kind of map of a Google spreadsheet list of data and turn it into something that I think is closer to a human moment of recognition and witnessing of this death. And so I've been told this will be up soon at Lewis and Clark, and hopefully you've been able to participate. If you haven't been able to participate yet, there may be time there. You can also look us up on our websites, hostileterrain94.org or the Undocumented Migration Project.org, and you can get information about how you can get involved with our current project, including what we're doing right now, which is called a moment of global remembrance. And we're asking 3,400 volunteers to make video or audio recordings of themselves reading out the names of the dead. And we're compiling that into a 15-hour-long video and audio recording that we will use both on our website and in exhibitions that are forthcoming. And so Hostile Terrain 94, we've been delayed because of the pandemic, but we are anticipating launching over 130 shows, physical shows, on 6 continents. Probably, we've got about 15 shows up now. If any of you are in Pennsylvania or the Netherlands, or I don't know, there's about 8 or 9 physical shows that you can go see using social distancing practices. But the rest of them, the 130 plus shows, will launch next year. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll see you at one of those shows. Okay, so now that I've given you some kind of background on border crossings, on the history of prevention through deterrence, I want to just give you a quick little view of what it looks like to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. This is a photo of two men that I came to know quite well around 2009, men that I refer to in my book as Memo and Lucho, who I met in a migrant shelter, and who I sort of documented their experiences. And on their final border crossing trip, they took disposable cameras with them and took photographs of their experiences, and have shared those with me, and allowed me to use them in various ways. So we're going to see some of their images right now. Memo and Lucho would tell you, if you want to cross the U.S.-Mexico border through the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, you typically start in the town of Altar. Altar is a known smuggling hub where people go there to meet up with their smuggler, where migrants sort of congregate. Basically, the town revolves around human smuggling, so much so that the local baseball team are called the Coyotes of Altar, coyote being a euphemism for human smuggler. So you would go to Altar, you would then hop on a bus with your smuggler, potentially, and they would drive you to the U.S.-Mexico border, where then you would enter the desert on foot and try to walk at least to the town of Arivaca, here shown here on the map, or potentially even walk all the way to Tucson, which many folks are currently now doing. So, 60 to 70 miles on foot from the U.S.-Mexico border to a place like Tucson. Before you can do that, you have to get some equipment. So if you've ever been to an outdoor market in Latin America, this maybe looks a little familiar, except for the fact that these vendors in Altar specialize in camouflage clothes, black clothes, backpacks, first aid equipment, hiking boots, and all the things that migrants need to get across the desert. So there's a super specialized economy that's in place in northern Mexico that caters directly to the hundreds of thousands of people who attempt crossings every year. So Memo Lucho would say, get your backpack, your water bottle, your first aid equipment, and now we're going to head out into the desert. And you'll need that equipment because you're going to have to walk across a terrain that looks like this. This is a photo those men took at the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're getting ready to walk over those mountains that are in the distance. And they're going to do this in the middle of the summer, where the temperatures are easily averaging over 100 degrees. They will do this oftentimes up into the mountains, typically with very few supplies. Whatever you can fit in your backpack, a couple of gallons of water. You're probably wearing cheap sneakers or construction boots, but you don't have all of the equipment that you would need. You don't have a compass, you don't have a map. Typically, people don't travel with any of that stuff. You can't have a map or a compass because the Border Patrol uses those things to mark someone as a smuggler. Even though no self-respecting smuggler would need a compass or a map to get across this terrain. But people are just using the stars. They're navigating by natural landmarks, and they're doing this over this incredibly difficult, difficult to traverse ground. They're doing it in darkness, total darkness, no flashlight. You don't want to walk around with a flashlight because you'll be spotted in a minute. You're hoping for good moon so that you can see a little bit as you're walking. And you're doing it at night also to keep cool because it's so hot, and it will help you to avoid detection. You're also doing this in a place where everything in nature has evolved to scratch you, bite you, inject you with poison, stick to your clothes. The Sonora Desert is home to the most rattlesnakes in the Western Hemisphere. So I think it's 14 species of rattlesnakes in this area. You've got things like javelina, which can be quite ferocious, centipedes, scorpions, cactuses that are there to stab you, poke out your eyes. It's a super difficult landscape. And, as someone who grew up in cities, and I don't consider myself to be an outdoor person, although I think I've become one through this project. This was a real rough experience for me to figure out how to be in this environment. And, I'm someone who hikes in $200 hiking boots, and I'm carrying 6 or 7 liters of water, and I have a compass, and I have a GPS unit, and I've got everything else I need. And it's still very, very easy to get in trouble out here. And I can't count the number of times that I've almost injured, or that I've been injured, or that I've been with a group where someone has gotten dehydrated or something else, or run into rattlesnakes. And so you can be totally prepared and still never be fully prepared for all the things that nature will throw at you. And this includes, dramatic swings in weather. Here are Memo and Lucho. They have been walking for 3 or 4 days. They've run out of water. They're dying of dehydration, and then suddenly find themselves in a ravine in the middle of a flash flood. And so you can die in a flash flood in the middle of the summer. You don't hear the water coming, and you can easily get swept away. And so this is a place where all these things can happen to you, and you just never know what to expect. And whenever I see this picture, I always want to thank Memo and Lucho for the fact that here are these men who are in the midst of this like deadly journey where they could die, struggling to survive and not get caught. They find themselves in the middle of this flash flood, and then they stop and go, you know what? I bet Jason would really love a photograph of this. I'm always just grateful that those guys were thinking about me, even though they shouldn't have been probably during this journey. But for them, it was important to be seen and for this stuff to be visible. And so I'm just deeply grateful for their trust and for their help in getting this work out there. Memo Lucho and others would tell you that after all of this stuff, your body takes an incredible beating. I mean, it is a physical exhaustion like no other. If you have a pre-existing medical condition, it's quite easy to then exacerbate it, or if you don't know about it, you figure it out pretty damn quick. And so people their bodies just take a dramatic beating, and also their psyche. I think there's a lot of PTSD that comes from these experiences that people don't really get to talk about. So it's just something to think about. People who have migrated, I think, carry the trauma, the physical and the emotional trauma with them for many, many years after the fact. Okay, so now that I've given you the history, I've given you a little bit of insight into what it looks like. The second half of this talk, I want to look at the unfortunate people who have not been able to make it through the desert. And so I'm going to tell a couple stories here. The Norwegian explorer Karl Lumholtz, 100 years ago, he wrote that the summer heat in the Sonoran Desert felt like you were, quote, walking between great fires. But I would be like, yo, you're just being too nice about this whole thing. Because right now, in this moment, it feels like I'm walking directly through flames. It's easily over 100 degrees outside, and it's only 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm climbing through the Tumacacori Mountains with my longtime friend Bob Key, a member of the Southern Arizona humanitarian group, the Tucson Samaritans. Bob has been out haunting these trails for years, leaving food and water for unseen migrants, and occasionally giving first aid to abandoned people that he comes across. We're walking on a rough path full of sharp angled rocks and these angry mesquite trees whose branches all seem to be pointing right at your eye as you walk past them. We're almost there, I promise, Bob says. I force a smile because whenever Bob tells me this, it's a white lie to make me feel better. When Bob says to me we're almost there, that usually means 4 more miles to go uphill. On this day, though, the tone in his voice is different. He's not his normal jovial self. He hasn't been joking around with me, which usually involves to carry me on his back or to carry my backpack for me. And this is always funny because I cannot keep up with Bob, and Bob is 30 years older than me. I don't know what that man eats for breakfast, but he's a superhuman person. But on this particular day, he's not giving me shit about how out of shape I am. It's clear that he's on a mission. We round a bend and we stop, and he calmly looks at me and he says, "This is the spot where I found the person. The sheriff came out and took away what they could, but it was getting dark, and we didn't have a lot of time to go over the entire area. It was mostly arm and leg bones that we found, and some pieces of clothing. I want to see if we can find the head," he tells me. "That would make it easier to find the body, to identify the body. I'm sure that there are still bones out here." And he's right. There are bones that the police overlooked, but we have to cover a lot of ground before we start to find them, and there are pieces strewn everywhere. We walk down slope, and I shit you not, I mean, I don't even know, like, this is something that, like, I'll have a vision of this occasionally and just be like, what the hell was that? I walk down a hill, and I see an articulated arm, a human arm, sticking up between 2 rocks in the middle of nowhere. Outside of the sinew that's holding those bones together, it's been picked clean of skin and muscle by some unknown creature. Further up the trail, I noticed some white flecks that stand out against the red mountain soil. It looks like someone's dropped a box of blackboard chalk on the ground. I get closer and I realize that they are splinters of human bone, mostly sun-bleached rib fragments that have been cracked and gnawed by some long-gone animal. Just off the trail, I spot a human tooth lying on top of a rock. This dental find gives us hope that the skull is nearby. We desperately start looking for this person's head. Rocks are overturned, subterranean nests are probed. Bleeding hands blindly grope under thick brush in hopes of finding bones that have been squirreled away by scavengers or deposited by monsoon floodwaters. Everyone is working with great urgency despite the debilitating heat. After 45 minutes of desperately surveying the surrounding area, we give up. There is no skull. We do, however, come across a pair of worn-out hiking boots in close proximity to some of the bones. But where the hell is the skull? I start imagining what has happened to it. There's this montage in my brain of laughing vultures that are ripping this person's eyeballs out of the sockets. I hallucinate in the distance 2 coyotes, and they're batting around the head of this person like a ball so that they can access the brain matter through the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull. It's a moment when you despise the capacity of the human imagination. People whose loved ones have disappeared in this desert will tell you that it's the not knowing what has happened to them, coupled with these flashes of grotesque possibility, that drive you insane. As we start to walk away, I notice something on the ground. I crouch down and I pick up a piece of bone smaller than my fingernail. It immediately starts crumbling to dust. I try to hand it to Bob, and a breeze passes through and blows many of the particles off of my hand. I scrape off my finger what I can into a plastic bag, but it's a futile gesture. There's very little that forensic scientists can do with bone dust. This person will likely become a line in the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner's database of migrant fatalities. It's going to say name unknown, age unknown, country of origin unknown, cause of death undetermined, partial skeletal remains. The identity of this individual has been swallowed up by the desert, and there were no witnesses. Their life, or become bare life, has been reduced to shoes, shards of bone, and the unknown. But maybe that database should say cause of death, prevention through deterrence. So now I want to talk a little bit about the things that happen to migrant bodies in the desert. And forensic scientists, we use this term taphonomy, which just refers to the cultural and environmental things that impact a body. So whether that's wind, water, rain, insects, or a human taking a body and burying it in the ground, all of those things are what we would call taphonomic processes. They're part of the things that happen after death. As I said, previously, there's been thousands of deaths that have happened along the U.S.-Mexico border, and over 6,000 across the entire border. That number now is probably closer to like 8,000 if we think about the nightmare that's happening in Texas at the moment. But when I began this project in 2009, there was so much speculation about what happened to bodies in the desert, and nobody could give me a good answer. No one could tell me that, hey, people decompose quickly, or it's slow, or these are the types of animals that scavenge. Maybe our numbers are good because bodies preserve, they get mummified. We didn't know really any of this stuff. And so I wanted to understand this better. And in order to do that, I needed better information on what happens post-mortem. I needed better information, better taphonomic information. And so I'm going to show some pictures in the next couple of slides of dead animals, of some dead pigs that have been used for this research. So just as a warning here. So starting around 2012, we began these taphonomic or decomposition experiments, and there had been very little that had been done before this. Most of it was anecdotal, and so we were the first people to take a practice that forensic scientists had been doing previously in other contexts, and that's using pigs as proxies for the human body. Pigs are the closest mammal sort of physiologically to humans. We have a similar organ distribution, similar weight, similar skin type. And so forensic scientists have been using pigs in a variety of contexts to understand what could have happened to a human body in those places. And so we basically just took this idea and now tried to apply it to the Arizona desert. And these animals were killed on site by professional animal handlers. I'm happy to talk about the ethics of this work in the Q&A because this was not an easy decision to do, but I'm always happy to talk about it and the rationale behind it and the ethics of it. These animals were killed on site. They were dressed in clothes that we would expect migrants to wear. So dark clothes. We gave them personal effects like wallets and identification, and we put them in a variety of different contexts: shade, direct sunlight. We covered some with rocks, and then we monitored them for several weeks at a time using remote activated cameras, so basically trail cameras. And I'm going to show you one of these videos now of one of these experiments. So here, this animal has been dead for about 2 days. If you can see my cursor here, these are the feet. One of the shoes has come off, and vultures have started to feed. And I'm going to just show you a 30-second clip of what it looks like during these experiments. And here's another picture. This is from experiments from 2018. This animal has been dead for just a few hours. And then this is about 4 days later. So all you have left are shoes, the part of the skull, and the backpack. Everything else has been either eaten and destroyed or moved completely far away that we were having a difficult time finding. And these experiments for us were difficult for all kinds of reasons. Both personally, emotionally, it was difficult to watch these animals die, but then also the results were quite shocking. The scavenging and skeletonization of bodies happened much quicker than we had ever anticipated. In some instances, less than 72 hours from fully fleshed to completely defleshed, disarticulated, and scattered widely. In some instances, things were completely missing, destroyed, or bones and personal effects were spread over, over 100 feet, if not more, making it really difficult to associate personal possessions with bones. And then we had some differences in, direct sunlight and shade. And probably the most shocking one was the bodies that we covered with rocks as a way to protect people, which is what migrants had been telling us that they were doing for a long time. Those actually sped this process up much faster because the rocks ended up heating the bodies. And vultures need flesh to decompose to a certain level, reach a certain temperature before they will feed. And so if you cover them with rocks, that actually speeds this whole thing up. So it has the opposite effect. And for the last part of this talk, I want to take what we've just seen, these experiments here and the brutality that these bodies are experiencing, and I want to put it into a discussion about politics and about how people experience this. And so about a week and a half, 2 weeks after we began these experiments in 2012, I had this particular experience. The 8 of us stand around her in silent awe. And it's obvious that not everyone here in this group has seen a corpse before, because somebody asked me if she's really dead. She's lying face down in the dirt and appears to have perished while attempting to get up a hill. To get here, she easily walked over 40 miles and had to cross through the Tumacacori Mountains. Rigor mortis has set in and her fingers have started to curl. Her ankles are swollen to the point that it looks like her sneakers will pop off at any moment. She's been dead for only a few days and is what forensic anthropologists would term early decomposition. Gray to green discoloration, some flesh relatively fresh, bloating, brown to black discoloration of arms and legs. These descriptions don't do justice to what the bodies left out in the desert actually look like, smell like, or sound like. Nothing does. After several days in the sweltering summer heat, her body has begun to change. Her skin has started to blacken and mummify, and the bloating is beginning to obscure some of her physical features. While parts of her are starting to transform into unfamiliar shapes and colors, her striking jet black hair and the ponytail holder wrapped around her wrist, they hint at the person that she once was. I ask one of my students to get a blanket out, and we cover her up. It makes those of us still alive feel better. High above her, turkey vultures circle her corpse. I count at least 4 of them, and I marvel at how quickly they've arrived on the scene. I try to ignore them. I get close to the body and awkwardly scribble down some field notes. No backpack or obvious personal possessions. A bottle of electrolyte fluids tucked under her shoulder and face. Later, I go and I sit with the remaining group of students under a tree a short distance from the body. The silence among us is tense and only occasionally broken when a breeze comes through and rustles the branches of nearby mesquite trees. Out of the blue, someone starts crying uncontrollably and is immediately consoled by a neighbor's kind embrace. Others sigh deeply, and someone angrily walks off into the distance to be alone. We sit quietly for what seems like an eternity. These vultures continue to circle overhead. They are simultaneously implicated in and oblivious to the complex human drama playing out below. All they know is that we've disrupted their meal plans. I want to say something to our group that will give us comfort or make this death seem peaceful or dignified. It's a ridiculous thought. There's nothing you can say in this scenario that doesn't sound contrived. Months later, someone will corner me after a talk and complain that the photo I showed of this woman's body perhaps robbed her of her dignity. But I will point out that the types of deaths that migrants experience in the Sonoran Desert are anything but dignified. That's the point. And maybe the only dignity in this whole scenario is the dignity that comes from dying while trying to improve the lives of those that you love and your own, and working towards something and making sacrifices so that others can prosper. I think maybe that's where the dignity in this whole thing comes in, but that's not what the federal government wants. These deaths, this thing right here, this is what prevention through deterrence looks like. These photographs should make us all uncomfortable, because the uncomfortable reality is that right now, today, corpses lay rotting on the desert floor, and there aren't enough witnesses. These photos provide compelling evidence that, contrary to what Susan Sontag says, we don't need to go to exotic places to get full frontal views of the dead and dying. The dead live in our backyard. Sitting there on that dusty afternoon, I finally blurt out, "At least we got to her before the vultures did." Her name was Carmita Maricela Zaguipuya, and this is the one toe tag that I fill out for Hostile Terrain 94 exhibitions. Cuenca, Ecuador. Carmita Maricela Zaguipuya, she was 31 years old when she decided to leave her family and her husband and 3 children in Cuenca in early June of 2012 to try and make it to the United States. She was abandoned by her smuggler after she became ill and was unable to continue walking. She likely died from a combination of hyperthermia and a pre-existing kidney condition. One of the last things that she said to her family in Ecuador was, "My kids are dying of hunger here. My kids are suffering. Whatever my destiny is, I must go." After finding her body, I made contact with Maricela's family in Ecuador and New York. And one of the biggest themes of our many conversations revolved around the condition of her body when it was returned. As her best friend and sister-in-law Christina told me in January of 2014, she said, "They told us not to open the coffin, but I wanted to see her. My plan had been for her to get to Ecuador, and then we would change her clothes. They said she was really messed up, so I wanted to put new clothes on her for the burial. When she got here, though, there was no face. There was no hands. She had been out in the desert for almost a week, and then she was in cold storage, unembalmed for over 3 weeks, and then shipped. Her hands had to be removed with a saw so that they could be rehydrated in saline to take her fingerprints. So her body was devastated. And Christina says to me, imagine how difficult it was to see her body like that. When she got here, she was destroyed. The coffin was a mess. The wood was dripping wet, and it didn't look like her. And there are doubts that it even was her. But they wanted to see pictures of the body. And so I brought pictures of the body to Cuenca, to Ecuador. And here's Christina looking at these photos. And she says to me, in case this is her buried here, then thank God we have the body. It's a miracle that she came back to us. She's only half complete, but she came back. If it is her, it helps us to move forward. But what I'm telling you is it's very difficult to believe that this is how she is. It's very hard to see her in this form. And I really thought that it couldn't get any worse after all of that. But unfortunately, it can always get worse. Clinical psychologist Pauline Boss has coined a term, ambiguous loss. It's a loss that refers to when you lose someone, but there's no verification of their death. They disappear. She argues that to not have a body, to not know if someone is dead or alive, freezes the grieving process, and it makes closure an impossibility. And I would argue that she's 100% correct. And I thought that, like I said, after Maricela's body, we found her, and after seeing the devastation that her family experienced and the things that her kids went through, after all that, I just thought it couldn't get any worse in the desert. And then it always can, unfortunately. It was something like 364 or 63 days from the moment I found Maricela's body. I was sitting at the airport in Tucson, Arizona, waiting to board a flight to go home after a field season, where I get a message from Christina on Facebook, and she says basically, "Can we call you? We have a relative that has gone missing in the desert." And so I got involved with her family, with another family. There was a 13-year-old boy that I called Felipe that I interviewed about this disappearance. And this is what he says to me. We were in the desert for 5 days. The water ran out. And his cousin, José, he kept stopping to sit and drink water. There were only a few people left at this point in the group. A lot of people stayed behind because their feet were hurting. We got to the start of a hill at about 6 a.m. and José fell down. His leg gave out and he just slumped down on the ground. He said he had enough. The guia came back and yelled, "You need to get up or I'm going to beat you." He started kicking him and José kept saying, yeah, okay. But he couldn't get up. He was sitting on the ground, looking all around, dazed. We left him with some water and went to get help. And we were picked up by immigration 2 days later. The person I left behind was 15-year-old José María Tacuri. I met with his family as I tried to help them figure out where their son was, where we could go look for his body, since I knew the desert very well. And I spent a lot of time interviewing the family about their experiences. And the family wanted to explain to me, why José was in the desert, how this whole thing had come to be. And so I interviewed his father in Long Island, New York, who wants to explain to me what had happened to his son. And this is what he says to me. He says, when I was in Ecuador, in Cuenca, José was my right hand. He was always with me. We were inseparable. But when I came to this country, he became a really rebellious child. I called him and I said, José, why have you changed? He said to me, no, Papi, it's your fault. You left me. We were like brothers. You were my everything and you left me. It's your fault that I'm like this. José had been left home with an aging grandmother in a house with little parental supervision. And like most 15-year-olds with no parental supervision, he was just out doing whatever it is he thought he should be doing, which in this case was just being wild, acting out, drinking, smoking, staying out late. He had become a rebellious kid. And his dad says to him, "Look, I didn't come here to New York because I wanted to. I came here to get ahead because in Ecuador, I can't give you the things that you need." And then he tells me, "I left when my son was 10 to provide for him and my family, and his wife soon followed after." He said, but he didn't really understand those things at the time. I kept asking him why he was acting up. I asked him why he had changed from being such a good kid. But all he kept saying was that he wanted to come here to New York, but I didn't understand why. He had everything there in Cuenca. They could send money home, he had internet, he had new clothes, but he was alone. He kept saying that me and my wife were to blame. He said he felt empty inside. He said he would go home and we wouldn't be there. He told me that being reunited with us would fill his emptiness inside. And so his dad tells me that his son called him from Mexico right before he went into the desert to try and cross. And then he says to me, the last time I spoke to him, to my son, he said, "Papi, I really want to talk to you." And I said, "Okay, well, let's talk." Not like this, not like this. I want to talk face to face, like father and son. It had been 5 years since they'd talked face to face. 5 years since they'd hugged each other. He says, "Okay, we'll wait until you get here. Or if you want, just tell me right now what's bothering you." He said, "No, it's not time to talk about it yet. When I get there, we can talk." Then his dad says to me, he never told me what he wanted to talk about, but I guess he met a girl in Ecuador and they went out for about 6 months. They were together before he left and this girl got pregnant. I guess this is what he wanted to tell me, that this girl was pregnant and would I help him? Maria José was born about 5 months after José disappeared. His dad says to me, "I didn't tell him, but to this day, I'm going to support her. I'm going to support his girlfriend and the baby girl that she's going to have. I'm not going to abandon her. But this is the remorse that I have," he tells me, "that I could never tell him face to face that I was really going to support him, that I could convince him of that." And then he says, his girlfriend calls every day to see if I have any news about José, to see if we know anything about him, to see if I've spoken to anyone. I say, "No, there is nothing." It's difficult to say no, to say that we have found nothing. She thinks I'm not doing nothing here, that we aren't calling anyone, that we aren't helping, that he is lost and we are just sitting here. But that's not true. We are trying to find any person that might know something about José, but there's nothing that we can do to get back that joy that we lost until we find him, to know something about what happened to him. He says, "There's nothing we can do though. We can't go down to the border and look for him. Nobody has paperwork. Nobody can be there legally." Then he looks at me and I can't even begin to describe the sorrow that one has in their eyes when they talk about a missing child. I mean, it's a look that I can't shake. It's a look that you don't even know. It's like it's an emotion that is so frightening and so just, it hits you in a way that I don't have words for it. But he gives me this look, and then he says to me, "To lose him like us, to lose him like this," he says, "and not know what happened to him is going to make us cry for the rest of our lives." He says, "Every day that passes, we feel more and more out of control. Sometimes it feels like I'm losing the battle. I try to wake up with energy some days and say, we are going to find him, we are going to find him. But we haven't found him. It's been 7 years and we have not found him. He looks at me and he says, it is difficult to live like this, to know nothing. And then he says, I just pray to God that we will somehow be reunited with Jose in some form or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for such a moving presentation that you just gave. We're going to take a quick 2-3 minute breaks, give people a chance to digest the information you just heard, and ask any questions you may have for Jason De León in the Q&A box, and me and Emmanuel will read those off. All right, I will get us started with the Q&A section. One of the audience members asked, have there been any attempts to classify these deaths as a crime against humanity, either by international courts or global humanitarian groups?
That's a great question. It's a conversation that's increasingly starting to happen. I'm hopeful that it actually will come to that. I do think that that it is a crime against humanity, that we're actively killing people with a policy, and we know that it is. But right now, I think there's so many other things that there's a million immigration dumpster fires right now that people are trying to deal with. But this is one, I think, for a long time people have been having this conversation, and I wouldn't be surprised in the future if it starts to get a lot more serious. And I would hope that it would move to that level.
Thank you. I'll present you the next question. This comes from someone who said thank you for coming, and they asked if you could and discuss how you deal with the ethical challenge involved with this work, especially in regard with you working or doing ethnographic work with a vulnerable population. Excuse me.
It's a difficult thing because clearly, I'm in a great position of privilege and power, and I'm working with people who oftentimes have none of those things. I think to do this kind of work and to do it respectfully requires a constant thinking about those things. It's very easy to write about the undocumented because they don't have lawyers to sue you. They don't have, the power to come at someone for saying things about them that they don't agree with. And they also don't have a platform oftentimes to tell their own stories. And so, and knowing all of those things, I try to be as cautious as I can. And for me, probably the crucial things are, I'm in a constant state of worry about the things I do, I say, I write about migrants, about other people's experiences, because I know that it's very easy to, for some folks, I think it can be very easy to suddenly claim some other person's experience or suffering, to become a spokesperson for those folks, sort of uncritically. And you get to, and I think part of it is you can have it where, people have really good intentions. They want to do right by someone, but they're not constantly checking in about, just because you feel good about this stuff or because you think that it's the right thing to be doing doesn't mean that it is the right thing to be doing. And so for me, I wear that worry on my sleeve at all times. I'm constantly second guessing myself and trying to, play devil's advocate. So that's really helpful. And then also just really checking in on the people that I write about and work with, and be like, this is where I'm going with this stuff. Are you comfortable with this? And I always, have them in the back of my head as I'm writing about them, as I'm putting stuff together, to go, what would they think if they were in the room? What would they say about this? Would they be happy with this? Would they be mad about this? Could I say and present these things in front of them with a straight face. And I think that's an evolving kind of thing, and it's something that constantly has to happen. But it's the moment I'm not super stressed out about this stuff, I think that's the moment I'll stop doing it, because it's so easy, I think, to just kind of appropriate and to take other people's stuff and go and do and tell whatever story it is that you want. I think that's a slippery, easy slope to get caught into, and it's my job to constantly fight against that, and to I have my own, like, my jury are the people who I write about. Like, that's my number one concern. Everyone else that engages with the work, whatever audience that is, they really come secondary to the folks that I'm writing about, because I began the work, and I do the work with a commitment to them, with a commitment to those relationships, and those commitments and relationships don't end when once I leave the field. I mean, they're there at every moment and every stage of the work, and that's, I think, for me, really keeps me in check, I hope.
Thank you. The next question comes from somebody who says, "Thank you, Jason. Your delivery was extremely powerful." And they have a question regarding the toe tags for hostile terrain and the significance of the land management designation. They say, "I found it interesting that so many of these bodies were found on the Tohono O'odham Nation, while prevention against deterrence and the humanitarian crisis is preliminarily fueled by a colonialist government."
Yeah, it's a great question, and the bulk of these deaths happen on Tohono O'odham land. It's a huge reservation with a lot of traffic that comes through it, and it's kind of one of these things where you have this sacred native space, this land that the federal government has now co-opted and turned into this death machine. And so now this sacred space has become invaded by the Border Patrol, who are funneling people across it, who then die on this land. And then oftentimes the reservation has to deal with migrant bodies, including the cost of transportation and all of those kinds of stuff. And they also have to deal with a whole lot of Border Patrol on their land. And so, a lot of Tohono O'odham believe that they live in an occupied territory now. They're no longer even in their own home anymore, because they're overrun with the Border Patrol. And so I think it's just one more way in which the federal government has just done wrong by Native people, and it's a terrible thing. It's also a very polarizing thing, I think, for a lot of folks on the res, because you've got people who are very sympathetic to, you have Native people who are sympathetic to the plight of migrants, but also the migrants then become a problem for these folks, because through these federal government kind of interventions, and so in a lot of ways too, it creates tension between marginalized communities. You have the people in power who are then creating this structure that you have brown people, Native people, who then are sort of butting heads in this really horrible way. But that's a huge, an enormous issue, and it's one that I don't really address sort of ethnographically, because I don't work on the res, but it's definitely something that I'm aware of. And if people are interested, there's a movie that came out about 10, 12 years ago. You can get it on YouTube. It's called Walking the Line. So not Walk the Line, which is the Johnny Cash movie. There's a movie called Walking the Line, and it was a documentary made by these undergraduate students. I think it maybe like Colby College, some Northeast small liberal arts college. This guy made this documentary for like $5,000 on migrant death in the Arizona desert, and he had an incredible amount of access both to militia idiots, but also to folks on the reservation. And it's one of the few films where I've seen where it really talks about both what's happening on Native land, but also the tension between folks who are sympathetic to migrants, but also don't want them coming across sacred territory and creating this kind of problem too. I think it's a really nice balance of perspectives if people are interested in that, and you can get it on YouTube. I found it recently. You just type in like Walking the Line border documentary, or do it in a search engine, and it should come up.
Thank you. We now have another question that's kind of two questions that that was put into the Q&A, and the questions are mainly asking about how do you kind of do this work every day, like what motivates you to do this work, and they use a really good word, mobilize with the symposium that's about movement. So like what kind of mobilizes you to do this work and to feel so motivated to do it with, as someone said, little evidence. Like you go out there and you never know what you might see. So what makes motivate you rather than debilitate you? And yeah.
You know, it's something that I began my career as a very I began my career not as a person who studies migration. I began my career um, as as an archaeologist who had been working in Latin America for many many years, and you know I liked the work. I enjoyed archaeology, um, and I started to kind of get sick of it. And as I was working in Mexico digging ditches, I started to get to know a lot of people who had had really traumatic border crossing experiences or people who were getting ready to migrate, and I became really interested in those issues. And once I got really interested in it, then I became so passionate about it because I just felt like people weren't talking about the stuff, and there were things that were happening that should offend everybody, and yet no one knew about it. And so I sort of gravitated towards this thing, and you know, it completely changed my life. It went from being, you know, this work that I went from like being an archaeologist who works on ancient kinds of stuff to being someone who is like fully committed to human rights issues and to issues of migration through research. And it just was a life changer for me. And I think, you know, growing up, I was a first generation college student. Um, you know, definitely no one in my family had ever gone to graduate school. Um, you know, going to college for me was just totally mystical. I had no idea what it was going to be. Was, I'm surprised I even got into college because I was just kind of all over the place. But one of the things that always stuck with me that my mom had said to me very early on, you know, she had been in the military for over 20 years. Um, she said that, you know, I've been in the army for a long time, but it's not a job that I really love. You know, it's a job that put food on the table and a roof over our head. But you know, I never got to go to college. I never got to finish college. I never got to do the stuff that I was really passionate about. And so she said to me, it doesn't matter what you do, as long as you love doing it, that you're not miserable doing it. And so once I found my passion for this stuff, then it was like it doesn't feel like work anymore. And it's hard, but it is hard to stay motivated um, because it's a depressing thing. I mean, the last, you know, you're working on this thing that you just know in my lifetime will not be resolved. And there's nothing that I can do that will fix this whole thing. But all I can do is to hope every day to make little baby steps to, you know, to connect with one person. If one person fills out toe tags and suddenly becomes inspired to learn more about this, or wants to, you know, to become a lawyer to go fix this stuff, or changes their mind about how they feel about immigrants, one of those little things for me, that's like a huge success. And those things really motivate me. um, and I feel like, you know, if I could put a spin on Trump, there was of course the lull, the deep depression, at least that I had after election night in 2016, where for like 3 or 4 days I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And then it was like, oh no, fuck this. It's time to get back to work. And now more than ever to go and do this stuff. Um, and you know, I think that Trump has been very, very good for motivating a lot of really pissed off people and people who were not mad before about stuff who now are like suddenly getting involved. And so I've taken motivation from like when I turn on the news now and I go, oh my God, the world's on fire. There's babies in cages and there's this and that. I can't let it just cripple me. I look at it and I go, it's time to get back to work. Now more than ever, we got to do this stuff. And I will say a thing that really motivates me right now has been students. One of the best parts of my job is being around young people who aren't jaded like perhaps some of us are, and who want to know a world that's better, and who are smarter about the world than I was. Those folks, I think, for me right now, it's a great moment to be inspired by people who just want to push forward. And so, you know, this administration has been really good for pissing off a lot of people. And I think like the Black Lives Matter movement, all the immigration stuff that's been going on, are reactions to these things that had been going on previously, hidden. I mean, for all the great things that Obama did, there were a lot of bad things that he did as well that were completely hidden from public view. And Trump just embraced all those things and put them forward for people who didn't want to believe that we live in a racist country. He didn't want to believe that a person in power could come out and be like, I support the Proud Boys kind of stuff. When they see that now, it's like, oh, you weren't kidding. I guess this stuff is really going on. And so now what are we going to do about it? That for me has kept me really going for the last 4 years. And I feel like we've turned a corner now too, going into this next administration where we're no longer going to be asking for crumbs. We're no longer going to be asked. We're not going to ask Joe Biden to bring us back to the middle, because the middle hasn't worked. The middle just hides all of the racism and inequality. We throw some crumbs to people to make them feel better about stuff, but behind the scenes, all this stuff is going on that's completely disempowering and marginalizing folks. I think everybody now is like, you don't get to go back to that, to this kind of faking it now. You need to now. We want, we're not going to reform these things. We're going to change these things, or we're going to burn them down and then rebuild them. And for me, it's a great moment to just to sit back and be inspired by young people who are just totally committed to this.
Thank you so much for that response. We probably have time for about one or two more questions. One person was asking if you could talk more about your new project or research on human trafficking and smuggling, and maybe some revelations you've had about researching that topic so far.
Sure. So I'm in the midst right now of writing a book. The book is called Soldiers and Kings. It will probably be out, I would hope, by the end of 2022, early 2023. I mean, as I say, writing, I've spent the last 4 months listening to hundreds of hours of audio, and I'm just kind of starting to write now. But the book is based on work that I started in 2015 with Honduran smugglers. So I went to Mexico in 2015, to the Guatemala-Mexico border, and kind of fell into working with a bunch of folks, young men and women who were coming from Honduras, who were smuggling migrants across Mexico. A lot of those folks have connections to either MS-13, or a lot of them are Bloods from the Bronx. So I work with a group of Mestizo Hondurans, so white Hondurans, and a group of Garifuna Afro-Hondurans who are both smuggling folks. And the book is basically about why people leave Honduras and how they fall into working with smuggling and with these gangs, and what their daily lives are like. And really, I think for me, the biggest revelation is, number one, when people ask about, why people are leaving Honduras, why people are leaving Central America, the folks that I work with have a relationship to murder that I don't think that most Americans, unless people, communities of color, I think, tend to know, people coming from very sort of bottom economic rungs who live in like violent settings, especially like violent urban settings, are probably the only people that have an understanding of like, someone will be murdered in your, multiple people in your lifetime will be murdered that that you're close with. And the folks I work with in Honduras, everybody's fleeing murder. Everybody's trying not to get murdered. And so that you have these folks that are just trying to survive and live a life when they're surrounded by all of this incredible violence. And, for me, it's really trying to understand how people make sense of that, and trying to move the narrative away from this kind of binary of there's the good migrant and then there's the bad smuggler, and really to get people to see that, like, nobody chooses to be a smuggler. People come to it in all kinds of different ways. And it's a very difficult, dangerous occupation. And it's one that's not lucrative for those who do it, but it's lucrative for the systems of power that require undocumented labor, right? We fuel the system. The systems of inequality create a need for human smuggling, which then creates this vacuum that pulls in all these people to get involved in this process. So for me, the book really is about the daily lives of these folks. And, they're folks that I'm really close with and people that I care about who happen to be wrapped up in all kinds of horrible stuff. And so a lot of the book, too, is about me trying to present profiles of people who are complicated. who perhaps do bad things, who are wrapped up in violence, but who are also, trying to be good parents, who are trying to be good, good family members, and yet are getting pulled in a million different directions. And so I'm hoping that it'll be an alternative kind of narrative to, like, it's, smugglers of course do bad things, but they also provide a service for people, and the people who do it themselves, um, they're living incredibly difficult lives as well.
All right. Well, we would like to thank you for coming to our symposium and letting us hear this great presentation. Would you like to say anything else before we close tonight?
Sure. I want to once again just thank all of you for attending, everyone for participating in Hostile Terrain 94. If you're interested in learning more about our work, you can go to our websites. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can go to our regular websites, and you can learn about all the stuff that we've been doing. You can learn about how to support us. We are a nonprofit, so people are interested in making a tax-free donation. You can do that. But also, if you just want to learn more stuff, there's tons of information about the things that we're doing. And if you go to hostileterrain94.org, you can get information about how to participate in our moment of global awareness. We would love to add people's voices to this digital event where we're going to read out the names of the dead as a moment of global recognition. And so, thank you all so much. I hope you're staying safe up there, and I hope that I can get up there in the near future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your powerful presence. Have a great night.
You too. Thank you.